This podcast contains explicit content and discussions related to real-life criminal activities, including violence and sensitive topics. Listener discretion is advised. The host's opinions are personal and are not representative of any individuals or organizations involved in the cases. We strive for accuracy, but if you've missed anything, please let us know. Thank you for listening. Welcome to Rotten Minds. I'm Kay.
And I'm V. Today, we're diving into the case of the most notorious and infamous serial killer couple in British history. Their romantic relationship is characterized by acts of sadism, violence, and a fascination with committing crimes together. The most terrifying part of it is that they wouldn't have been caught if it wasn't for the brother-in-law selling them out to the police. Before we get into the case, here's a disclaimer. This case contains mentions of kidnapping and sexual assault, so please listen with care. This case is a long one and will be divided into two parts, so make sure to check out the other part.
Let's start with Myra Hindley's background. Myra Hindley was born on the 23rd of June 1942 in Crumpsall, Manchester, England, to Nellie and Bob Hindley. She was raised by her mother and grandmother until the age of 4 when her father Bob returned from World War II. They decided to get settled and moved to a house just down the street from her grandmother, Helen's house. The home was not in a good condition and she was made to sleep in a bed next to her parents' bed. Bob was a severe alcoholic and abused his wife. Adding to that, with the birth of Myra's little sister Maureen, the abuse grew worse, and now he had begun to occasionally hit his children. When the fights got bad, Myra used to take her little sister to her grandmother's house down the street. Eventually, the parents came to an agreement that the kids would live at their grandmother's house and just regularly visit their parents. Both girls had a good relationship with their grandmother and she spoiled them rotten. Since Bob had served in the army and was known to be a tough man, he expected his daughter to be equally as tough and taught her how to fight. He taught her a couple boxing moves in order to stand up for herself in case anyone decided to pick on her. When 8-year-old Myra was picked on by a boy she used to play with, she ran home crying to her father, to which he replied by threatening to hit her if she did not retaliate. So the next time the boy tried to pick on her, she delivered a series of punches that knocked him down, and this made her father very proud, extremely proud, more proud than he was at any other moment of her life till then. I think this is sort of like reinforcing behavior in all kids, not just Myra, that if your parent was super proud of you doing something particular, you try to do it again so that you can get that validation from them. And I guess that kind of led into her later life. On June 1957, 13-year-old Michael Higgins, a boy at school whom she had previously saved from his bullies and who she had later become friends with, had invited her to swim at a reservoir with him. She wasn't usually one to reject Michael, but since she had early plans with her friends, she turned him down. Later during the day, she heard a group of kids talking about an incident that happened at the reservoir, and she immediately knew that something had happened to her friend. She ran all the way over there and she saw a crowd of people push past them to find her friend dead. He had drowned in the reservoir, and because she was a good swimmer, they had always went together, and so she blamed herself for his death. His funeral was held at the exact monastery where she had been baptized as a child. So after her friend's death, she decided to connect back with Catholicism. Myra decided to get a job after her graduation and started working as a junior clerk at a local engineering firm. She ran errands, typed, made tea, and was quite well liked. So when she had lost her first week's paycheck, the people she worked with felt sympathetic and contributed to her wage. But soon, she started repeating the same act over and over again, so much that her colleagues hesitated to help her. Myra had developed this interest of being different from other girls, so she decided to dye her hair blonde, which she did until she went to prison. She had also taken weekly judo classes, but partners were reluctant to train with her because they said that she was too slow in breaking a chokehold. At 17, she became engaged to a man after a short courtship, but after she determined that he was too immature to give her the life she wanted, she broke off the engagement. She also felt that she didn't want to settle down like the rest of the women her age and start a family. She wanted to live her life, and that's what she did. At 18, she had taken up a job at Millwoods as a typist. She soon developed an infatuation for Ian Brady, her coworker. He showed absolutely no interest in her, and I guess that kind of drove her to fall more in love with him. He was not the type to swoon over her, but I guess that kind of attracted her more to him. Ever since Myra had gone blonde, she started receiving attention from men more than often, and she was kind of getting tired of it and didn't like to be chased. She liked to chase, I guess. So she started a diary, and every day she wrote about him. Things like, he looked at me today, he talked to me today, and was so deeply infatuated with the idea of him.
Now, let's dive into Ian Brady's upbringing. Ian Brady was born in Glasgow as Ian Duncan Stewart on 2nd January 1938. His mother, Margaret Peggy Stewart, was an unmarried tea-room waitress, and she was a single mother to Ian. She decided to give him up for unofficial adoption, and Mary and John Sloan decided to adopt him. They weren't in a much better financial condition than Margaret, but they were capable of raising another child in their house. Ian took their family name and became Ian Sloan. His mother continued to visit him throughout his childhood, but she never made it known that she was his mother, not until later. Ian grew up with the 4 children of Mary and John Sloan and had a pretty happy childhood. They treated him well, but sometimes he felt like the odd one out. Margaret used to bring him gifts and stuff, and he just thought that she was probably his mother's friend. But later, when she told him that she was his biological mother, I guess that kind of made him feel better because now he knew that he wasn't completely abandoned. He was about 10 when his mother decided to marry a man and move to Manchester in England. This made seeing her hard, and this really impacted his life. The once good kid was now getting into a lot of fights, and you can kind of say that he was a lot more rebellious now. I mean, he must have felt really abandoned and angry about the one person being related to him just leaving him like that. He was the leader of a group of friends, and he used to always start fights, pick on other kids, and even turn the other boys against each other. Now, Ian was very interested in the Nazis, and keep in mind that World War II had just happened, so people hesitated to talk about it, but it wasn't like no one knew anything about it. However, Ian was more well versed in the whole history of the Nazis than any other kid in the group. So they used to sit with him and listen while he talked about the Nazis, and they used to play pretend and kill each other, and this kind of relationship made the boys want to do whatever they thought he would like. Sort of like they always wanted to meet his expectations. One day, Ian was picking on a boy with his group of friends and told him to tie him up to a tree, which they did. He asked them to cover him with newspapers, and he started talking about how he was going to take a matchstick and light it. The boys obviously didn't believe it because what kind of child would do that? And that was until he did it. The boys then realized what was happening and quickly freed the boy. However, we don't know if this story is true or not because even into adulthood he solemnly denied this ever having happened. I mean, for the kind of psychopath he is, he'd probably be proud and own up to something like this, but he didn't. So we're just gonna consider this as a speculation. It was said that he also used to kill animals, and this was told by a girl who saw him standing on the roof and throwing a cat down to kill it, but it did not die. It was and still is kind of stereotypical that psychopaths begin by killing animals, but this isn't the case sometimes. Ian strongly denied these accusations because he had this immense love for animals. Ian used to have this dog named Sheila, which he adored to death. So one day when he came back home, he found his mother crying, and he knew that something had happened to Sheila. He ran around the house calling her name, and after he found out that she had passed, he stormed out of the house in tears because he wanted to clear his head and said that he saw the face of death or something like that. After his dog's passing, life was pretty much the same. He was still the bully and leader of his friend group. Throughout his childhood, Ian committed a lot of petty theft, and as a teenager, he appeared before a juvenile court twice for housebreaking. This obviously created problems in the foster family because their biological children would never do this. Yet, they still didn't threaten to kick him out or anything like that, which shows you the kind of caring environment he grew up in. He left the academy at 15 and got a job as a tea boy, a job which later he left for becoming a butcher's messenger boy. Ian had a girlfriend, Evelyn Grant, and that's when his abusive behavior started coming into display. He threatened her with a flick knife after she had gone to a dance with another boy. He again appeared before the court with 9 charges against him, and he was placed on probation on the condition that he live with his mother. Since Ian's mother had gotten married and moved to Manchester, he too moved there, and his stepfather, Patrick Brady, got him a job as a fruit porter, and Ian took his surname. Just within a year, he was caught stealing a sack full of lead seals. He was then sent to Strangeways for 3 months. Since he was still a minor, he was sent to a borstal, which was basically a youth detention center. He was caught drunk on alcohol and was sent to a much tougher unit. After being released on 14th November 1957, he returned to Manchester and took up another job and was dismissed from another. Finally, deciding to get his act together, he borrowed a lot of instruction manuals for bookkeeping from the local library, and this quite shocked his parents because he used to study alone for hours in his room. In January 1959, Ian applied for a clerical job at Millward's Merchandising, which he was offered a position at. He was described by his co-workers to be a quiet, punctual, but short-tempered man. Ian often read a lot of books, including Teach Yourself German and Mein Kampf, and a lot of Nazi books, and owned a Tiger Club motorcycle.
So let's get back to Myra and her infatuation with this mysterious colleague of hers. So she started a diary, and this was specifically just for him. She even wrote in her diary how she wished that he would love her and marry her. Despite Myra being completely obsessed with him, he never gave her anything. And through this you can see his manipulation techniques. He used to either give her nothing or just give her the tiniest bit of attention, like asking her for a favor or smiling at her. He really kept her on her toes, and that kind of drove her to become completely obsessed with him. Myra kept trying again and again and was quite disheartened a lot of times because he would just completely ignore her existence. So she decided to take a different perspective. And since he was never one to visit pubs or be outside quite often, she decided to read the books that he read in order to get his attention, which it did. So they get closer over time, and then he asks her out to a dance, which she agrees to. Soon after, they went out on their first date and they watched a religious movie together, which Myra loved but Ian didn't because he was an atheist. So after the movie, they go outside for drinks and he starts dissecting this movie and expresses his views and slowly manipulates Myra into starting to believe in his views. Within a couple of weeks of dating Ian, she ends up losing her virginity to him. Keep in mind that since Myra was a Christian, she was really fixated on the idea of saving herself for marriage, and even when she was engaged, she did not have sex with her fiancé. Basically, Myra's whole concept and what she believed in changed when it came to Ian. He completely changed her. Myra recalled that the sex was really violent, and since it was her first time, she didn't know what to think of it. But later on, when she understood more, it just felt like BDSM. Shortly after losing her virginity, she introduced Ian to her mother, Nellie. Nellie wasn't at all approving of this man because she saw a glimpse of her controlling, abusive husband in Ian. However, Myra didn't care because this had been the man she was dying for. She wanted him so bad that she did not care about anything else. Myra had previously written how she wished he would marry her, but this wish later changed because Ian thought that marriages were impractical and useless. Later on, in her 30,000 letter for parole, she wrote, "Within months, Ian convinced me that there was no God at all. He could have told me that the earth was flat, the moon was made of green cheese, and that the sun rose in the west. I would have believed him." Such was his power of persuasion. So over time they settled at the moors, and one thing they used to do quite often was take their dogs out and let them loose, while they sat on a blanket with a bottle of wine and talked about a lot of concepts. He used to also talk about how he hated people that hurt animals and wanted to harm them. This eventually led into a conversation about how he wanted to commit crimes with her and how she was the perfect partner for him, and that, together, they would be invincible. They started committing smaller crimes at first, but he used to talk about committing the perfect crime, a crime so well thought out that they could potentially outsmart the police.
Ian believed that he was more intelligent than any other police officer or any of the equipment they had, and you can see that he had a very evident God complex. He said that the reason he hadn't committed crimes up until then was because he needed a perfect accomplice with the perfect traits, and Myra Hindley turned out to be just that. They planned to commit a series of stall robberies and bank robberies, and for that, they needed a getaway car, but neither of them knew how to drive. Ian couldn't get a license because of his extensive criminal record, so Myra decided to take the test but ended up failing it 3 times before finally getting it. Because she wanted to please Ian in every sort of way, she was always the one to do his dirty work. Taking the license, joining a gun club, and learning to shoot, and even purchasing guns, she was the one doing all the dirty work. He also often spoke to her about a book called Compulsion by Mayor Levin, and the story talks about how 2 young men from wealthy families abducted a 12-year-old boy and attempted to commit the perfect murder and escape the death penalty to prove that they could get away with murder. He pointed out the mistakes the men made, which resulted in them being caught, and Myra made a special note to keep them in mind. Then Ian turned to her and asked her to commit the perfect crime with him, to which she agreed. So they start preparations and go to a local school to determine their perfect victim. Ian also took pictures so they could go home and analyze them for reference. Finally, on the day of July 12th, 1963, they would end up committing the perfect crime. So they head to Myra's grandmother's house to plan, and they ensured that they had very little belongings so that they don't make the same mistake as the men from the story did of leaving their glasses behind. Ian ends up checking all the buttons on his and Myra's clothes to make sure there weren't any loose buttons that could come off easily, and counted each of them so he could then count them again before they left the crime scene. So they leave Myra's grandmother's house with Myra driving the van and Ian just behind her on his motorbike. Ian knew that he needed a female accomplice rather than a male because when they were abducting kids, a woman would be the most trustable for a child. It was always parents telling their children not to get in a strange man's car, and it was never about a woman. And Ian would drive behind, closely following the van. And when he thought that he found the perfect victim, he would flash his lights, and Myra would pull over and offer the child a ride. Now, Pauline Reed was getting ready to go dancing on a Friday night. Pauline was a very shy girl, and she and her friends used to go dancing together, but once these girls' parents found out that there would be alcohol at the party, they all refused to send their daughters. Pauline begged her friends' parents, saying that they wouldn't drink any, but the parents still refused. Normally, if none of her friends were going, Pauline wouldn't go either, but for some reason, she decided to get out of her comfort zone and go alone.
Pauline's mother was quite hesitant, but she knew that Pauline was mature enough to take care of herself. So Pauline gets dressed in this pink dress and a blue coat and puts on some new white shoes, and her mother puts a locket around her neck before she leaves for the party at 8 p.m. Meanwhile, Ian and Myra were driving along the roads, and Ian found the perfect victim and flashed his lights at Myra, but she didn't pull over. She told Ian that the reason why she didn't stop was because the 8-year-old girl that they saw was a neighbor of her mother's, and it was too risky, and that Myra would have been considered a suspect if something happened to her. Besides, since she was a child, there would have been a public outrage, more than compared to when a teenager is abducted, because people would believe that the teen had just run off. So they continued till Ian finds the next victim, Pauline Reed. Recognizing her as a friend of her sister Maureen, Myra pulls over and offers a ride to Pauline to the party. Seeing a familiar face, she complies and gets in the van. Once Pauline was in the van, Myra asked her to help her find an expensive glove in Saddleworth Moor. Pauline agreed, seeing no harm in it, and Myra introduced Ian as her boyfriend and that he would help her in finding the glove. So they pull up to the destination, and then Pauline and Ian go searching while Myra allegedly stays behind. Ian Brady returned after 30 minutes alone and took Myra to the location where Pauline lay dying. Pauline's clothes were a mess, and her head had been nearly decapitated off of her body by 2 cuts to the throat, including a 4-inch incision across her voice box that was done with considerable force, into which the collar of her coat and a neck chain, possibly the locket, had been pushed into. When Myra asked Ian if he had raped Pauline, he replied with, "Of course I did." Myra stayed with Pauline while Ian went to get a spade that he had hidden nearby, then returned to the van where Ian buried Pauline. Ian took very good care to hide the weapon and ensured that it had not gotten any blood in the interior of the van, and made sure to double check to not leave any evidence behind. According to Ian Brady, Myra had not only been there, but she had even participated in the sexual assault. When Ian Brady and Myra were returning back home, they passed Pauline's mother and brother out searching for her. When she hadn't returned, her mother, being really worried, decided to go to the social club and search for her, but there was no one there. The whole family spent the entire night running around and screaming her name, and when they felt that their search was in vain, they finally called the police and reported Pauline Reed missing. Meanwhile, Ian and Myra were meticulously cleaning the van for every nook and cranny to get rid of evidence. Then they stripped off their clothes and burnt it along with the murder weapon. Myra got a bottle of wine and they lay together, drinking as they watched their clothes burn and talked. Ian recalled feeling like an absolute god and how he was untouchable by the police and that he had outsmarted them. But the next morning, one of them confessed to the other about how they had accidentally stolen something from Pauline, somewhat around 9 pounds. Ian later on confessed to the police that Myra had stolen it, and Myra blamed it on Ian. They had decided to get rid of this money and decided to purchase some things for themselves. Myra ends up confessing that she had taken Pauline's locket, and Ian was furious. So the two of them went back to the moors and dug a little hole and buried the locket along with Pauline. Weeks after, Pauline's mother used to get on buses and look around and see if she could find her daughter. Pauline's mother had entered into this stage of deep depression that she had to be admitted to a psychiatric ward. A few days after committing the murder, they went back to the grave with a bottle of wine and talked about murder as they sat on Pauline's grave. They even went as far as taking pictures of each other and their dogs on top of the grave.
Soon, it was Myra's 21st birthday, and Ian gifted her a gold watch, and her neighbor gifted her the van that they had used for committing the murders. It was previously the neighbor's, and since he had gotten a new car, he thought of gifting it to her. The neighbor told her that there were a lot of legalities and taxing, but she didn't care. One day, a police officer showed up at their door regarding the illegal driving that Myra was doing. He had taken a liking to the van and Myra and told her that he wasn't allowed to exchange money while on the job, so he asked her out on a date, to which she agreed. Myra goes on this date and begins having an affair with the police officer. He tells her about how she has the potential of being a good cop and how she was really intelligent and sort of disciplined. So Myra goes home and tells this to Ian, and he agrees, thinking that it would be good to have someone on the inside that would leak information about the investigations. Eventually, Ian finds out about the affair and he goes insane. He tells her to quit the training for becoming a police officer and how he would never let her become a police officer as long as he lived, and she complied. Soon, the Pauline Reed case goes cold and Ian feels invincible, and you can practically say that his ego was through the roof now and he was ready to commit a second murder, but Myra didn't want to. On November 23rd, 1963, Ian and Myra headed to a marketplace to find their next victim. Myra wore a black wig or scarf to hide her bleached blonde hair because it wasn't common for women back in the day to have blonde hair. And especially when you're abducting a child, you don't want to draw attention to yourself. So that day, John Kilbride was helping out at the local market. He was the oldest of 12 siblings and was quite mischievous and was a sweet boy that was very helpful. Now, John and his friends were out to watch a cinema, and on their way home, they decided to stop by at the market. They used to go around the stalls asking if the shopkeepers needed any help, and if they did help, they would earn a little bit of pocket money. So the boys spread out into different stalls and would go home at different times. After John had finished his work, he sat near a wall and was eating biscuits that the shopkeeper had given to him. And that's when he was approached by a woman, that woman being Myra Hindley. She expressed her concern about how it was getting late and how his parents would be worried and offered to drop him home, which he accepts. She told John that Ian was her boyfriend and he would be sitting in the back. On the ride there, Ian mentions Myra's glove and she turns and tells John about how precious the glove was to her and asks if he could help her find it. Now John, being the helpful, sweet little boy he is, agrees to the request. So Myra describes the murder to unfold exactly as the first one and how she waited in the van while Ian killed the boy. However, Ian says that she had taken part in both the sexual assault and murder of the boy and even went as far as holding the boy down as Ian assaulted him. Ian had wanted to slit the boy's throat, but he had left the knife and decided to strangle the boy with a cord. And again, just like the first murder, they did everything, sort of like a routine from the burying to the cleaning up.
Meanwhile, John's mother was starting to think that something was wrong. John usually was home by 5 p.m., but today he wasn't home. She started to consider a few reasons as to why he would be staying out late, but these started to diminish soon. Shortly after, she called the police. They asked around with every single one of his friends, and all of them had the same story, seeing him last at the market. John's brother went from door to door, asking around if anyone had seen his brother, and his mom used to make an extra cup of tea and food and leave it on the table in case John decided to come back home. Now, Ian and Myra were deeply enjoying this. They used to park their van nearby and watch the family and the police go in and out, trying to find even the slightest of clues as to where their son was. And once again, they would take a bottle of wine and blankets and sit on top of John Kilbride's grave and talk and take pictures. By now, Ian and Myra got a new dog, and this puppy was called Puppet, and they would take this puppy out to the moors and sit on top of the graves and take pictures with it. Now, the police and the neighbors were starting to suspect John's father as a murderer, and this caused a huge effect on him. I mean, he had already a lot on his plate, and he was worried about his son's disappearance and was searching around, and adding to that, people had started suspecting him of doing such a thing to his very own child. On June 16, 1964, the next murder, nearly after 8 months, would take place. 12-year-old Keith Bennett was the oldest of 5 siblings living with his mother and stepfather. He was adventurous and had a great love for nature and loved being outside. He was very close with his family, and on this day, they were going for a very special sleepover at their grandmother's house. Now, Keith's mother walked him halfway there, and seeing him off, she returned home. He was just a few turns away from his grandmother's house, and at that moment, Ian and Myra were driving around looking for their next victim. Ian spotted the boy and told Myra to pull over and offer the boy a lift in exchange for coming to the local off license and helping to move some boxes, to which Keith agreed. Now it unfolds exactly as the other two murders, and we're going to be talking about Ian's perspective. So, they were walking this boy down the moors, and Ian began whistling a song to Myra, the secret little song. And that was her cue to attack the boy, pin him down, which she does. Then Ian sexually assaults this boy and strangles him. Before burying the body, Ian took photos of Keith Bennett's body and then filled the grave. They go back home and clean up, but this time they don't stay together and drink wine and talk about the murder. They go to their own separate houses, kind of showing that it has become quite usual to them. It was no longer something worth celebrating. So Keith's grandmother notices, but she doesn't mind because she thought that he had probably decided to stay back. So the next morning, when she walked the rest of the children back to the house, Keith's mother asked where he was, to which his grandmother replied that she thought that he was with her. Immediately, they called the police because Keith had been missing for a long period of time, and the police ended up connecting the murders of the two boys, and a search began. And just like John's case, they suspected Keith's stepfather. They went as far as taking apart floorboards and digging the garden because they thought that the kid's father would do something this horrid despite the father and son having a good relationship. Now Keith's mother was so hurt by this that she decided to go to the police station and told them to stop accusing her husband, or else she would not only kill herself but also her 4 children. I mean, imagine how traumatized Keith's mother was, and on top of that, having your husband being suspected as a criminal who did this. Possibly at that point of time, I don't think they know what happened to Keith, right? Already having your child go missing is crazy enough, but on top of that, having your own husband accused for this possibly atrocious crime, at that point they don't know exactly what happened to him. So even being a suspect in this crime is going to even stress you out more.
Yeah.
People start to look at you different.
Yeah, I can just only imagine about something like that happening. I honestly don't know what she might have felt in that moment, or like how enraged and disappointed and angry she must have been. So
yeah, this is a pretty scary statement to make, that she would harm the kids and herself. It must have really driven her off of the edge, and I don't blame her. Seriously, yeah.
now, during Keith's disappearance, Keith's mother was heavily pregnant, and due to the stress, she ended up having an early labor, but the baby was healthy, and it must have really mentally affected her, not only having to look after the newborn baby, but also her other 4 children. She ends up developing hallucinations about seeing Keith and hearing his voice, which later disappeared, and doctors narrowed it down to the stress from pregnancy. Keith's mother and John Kilbride's mother ended up bonding because they understood that they two were the only ones who could understand each other after their boys had gone missing. Ian had developed a picture they took of Keith's body, but the picture was blurry, so they decided to burn it. The next murder is 6 months later, and normally with serial killers, their killing span gets shorter and shorter because they have to satisfy this urge, but not him. It was almost as if he was killing to prove that he was more intelligent than the police and that they had nothing on him. Now, during the span of 6 months, a new person enters into this mess. Maureen's husband, David Smith, Myra's brother-in-law. David was nearly a decade younger than Ian and ended up looking up to him, and since Ian was this disciplined and well-organized person, his respect for him grew. While Myra hated her brother-in-law, Ian's god complex was reaching a new height. He loved being looked up to and respected. Every time they hung out, the men would be in pairs and the 2 women would be in pairs. David's mother passed away when he was just 4 months old, and he was raised by his grandmother while his father was serving in the army. He grew up thinking that his grandparents were his parents. Shortly after, his grandfather started gambling, and they used to get these fluctuations of money. When David was around 7, his father came back into his life and brought him gifts, but then gradually he would abandon him. Now, it hadn't caused such a big effect on David because he still had his grandparents and was absolutely adored by his grandmother. She would spoil him with all the goods when they had the money, but when they didn't, she would spoil him with affection. David's grandmother was an alcoholic, but she didn't display it to the neighbors or anyone when she used to get multiple bottles of alcohol. So David used to get her the alcohol. One day, David came back home and asked his grandmother why he was getting free meals as part of the program in which the children of low-income families used to get free meals. He asked her this when his friends questioned him why he was getting free meals when he had quite a bit of money. His grandmother sat him down and told him that his mother hadn't actually passed, but she was very poor, so she did this in order to make the burden on his grandparents a little lighter. David was very upset at this, and mostly upset at his grandmother for having lied to him. He was so hurt to the point that he went back to calling his grandmother Mrs. Smith when he used to call her Mom earlier. One day at night, his father returned and took David while he was sleeping and loaded him into the car with just the pajamas he was wearing and the stuffed animal that he was hugging at the time. He took him to a room which he had rented from the landlady, and the place was horrid, and the lady in particular was horrible to David, in so much that he once hit her. Now, David had changed from this well-behaved boy to a rebel that got into a lot of trouble, much like Ian Brady. Like Ian, he too was sent to the Borstal where he learned boxing, but later on dropped it after having lost interest. Now, David was the bad boy and was often known as the heartbreaker. He had previously dated Pauline Reed, and there wasn't so much going on. He was questioned when Pauline had gone missing because he was her ex-boyfriend, and he gave the exact description about Pauline that the rest of the kids had given and couldn't be linked to her murder.
And that is it for this episode. We'll come back with a part 2 on this case. This case is quite long, and I believe that this case needs to be covered in its entirety with the specifics.
And especially when I was writing the script, it was quite lengthy and there were a lot of details that I had to I couldn't leave it out. So
Right. So we'll come back with a part 2 on this case. And until then, stay safe. See you in the next episode. I'm Kay.
And I'm V.
And this was Rotten Minds.